Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the next edition of CNF Talks. I have with me today Tom Williams, who's the head of energy and infrastructure at Downing. And Tom's going to be speaking at our upcoming conference, the UK Sustainable Infrastructure Summit, which is being held on the 12th of November in London. Tom, welcome.
Well, thanks very much for having me on.
Very good to have you with us. The first question I'd like to put to you is around your role as a responsible investor, and obviously one very interested in renewable energy in particular. But what are the key criteria that you use when you're evaluating potential investments?
Well, look, I think the key is the balance of risk and reward.
Mm,
And if I think about renewable energy, which is where we spend most of our time at Downing, we think about two main areas. So if you think about revenues, you think about long-term revenues, you think about quality of earnings,
mm,
and it's really about the nature of the revenue streams that are associated with your investment. Are they inflation linked?
yeah.
Is the pricing fixed or variable? Is it just have a long-term contract for those revenues, or is there a sort of market-based element to it? So, and the blend of those different revenue streams really helps you understand the nature of the risk associated with achieving them.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there is the risk that you have to take in order to get to a place where you start earning revenues. So, is that asset operational?
Mm,
If so, what kind of operational risks are there? If it's greenfield, what does it take to get it built?
mm,
Do you need to take development risk? Do you need to take construction risk?
mm,
And this is probably where things get quite a bit more complicated as the nature of these risks are changing.
yeah.
Perhaps I'll give you one example. So grid connections. We have generation projects coming through now. So a solar park, for example, with non-firm connections facing grid constraints out to the mid to end 2030s.
Wow.
So
Wow.
um, if you want to build that asset, if you want to connect before 2035, 2040, then you're going to have to take some risk that you might be constrained in your ability to export. So then you
Mm,
have to have a constraints analysis. You have to
mm,
consider the behavior of assets above you in the LIFO stack. I
mm,
didn't really even know what a LIFO stack was 5 years ago.
yeah.
Um, and these are considerations that just didn't exist 5 to 10 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
We've been investing in renewables for 15 years now, and the risk has changed a lot over that period. We're in
Mm,
a very, very fortunate position. We have 80 people in our energy and infrastructure business,
mm,
including engineers, including specialists in grid infrastructure to
yeah.
help analyze and manage these risks, but many don't. And
Mm.
it's an extremely challenging and very rapidly developing area.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like that. I mean, that delay for grid connections in particular, so much uncertainty. I mean, obviously, that the government's reviewing its national infrastructure strategy. What elements, in that regard, what elements do you think need to be improved upon from an equity investor perspective?
Well, I think if the government has any hope of getting close to its renewable energy deployment targets, it really
Mm,
has to focus on grid and planning.
yeah.
I think it's very, very, very simple, and I think um, that will solve the vast majority of the really knotty challenges that are out there.
Mm,
Um, I mentioned one example of grid.
yeah.
The just right now people are receiving connections in the 40s. So difficult to make a difference to
Mm,
2030 targets if
mm,
you're getting a connection that's 10 to 15 years after that. And um, planning has been difficult,
mm,
particularly local planning, where
yeah.
often you run into sort of very specific considerations at a local level, which perhaps um, people look at and weigh more strongly than perhaps the
Mm,
national guidelines that central government hopes people are applying,
mm,
and that becomes quite difficult for people. Often these projects go to appeal where and or public inquiry, as we had one of our
yeah.
projects recently go to, where those things are looked at more in the context of what the national guidelines and the national planning requirements are. But those things are very difficult. They take a very long time, and they also take a very long time to fix. So the government is doing exactly the right thing by really shining a spotlight on those issues.
Mm.
But I think it'll take some time to sort out.
Yes, I mean, it very much sounds like that. And I guess you invest globally, or at least regionally. So when you look at UK projects, given those problems, say, over grid connections and planning issues, versus those located elsewhere in the world, how does the UK stack up from your point of view as an investment location, if you like?
Mm. Yeah, well, look, over my career, I've invested in most parts of the world,
Mm,
um, uh, and here at Downing we have just around about £1 billion invested in renewable energy across Northern Europe.
mm,
So we do see different regimes and different approaches, and we do assess the relative attraction of different jurisdictions against one another.
mm.
I think the strengths of the UK are really historically about the rule of law, about
Yeah.
the legal system, about transparency, about ease of
Mm,
doing business, about not being overtly protectionist. I think we've had historically consistent tax and regulatory regimes, and historically, we'll come to weaknesses in a second, fiscal prudence and a sensible monetary policy.
mm,
Um, Now, on the weaknesses side, I think often the specific policy direction around renewable energy has been a little bit uncertain, and perhaps over the last few years, particularly leading into the election, a little bit politicized.
mm.
Um, I think the current government, on the other hand, has been much stronger on this and has made very definitive statements and policy goals, which I think has been very welcome.
Yeah.
And it looks like we'll have some very clear direction of travel for the bulk of the heavy lifting to get to
Mm,
2030, which is going to be this current parliament.
mm.
I think the trust budget did just an enormous amount of damage to the
Yeah.
UK's international standing, and there is just no getting past that, unfortunately.
Mm.
And I think what people sometimes lose sight of is that the vast amounts of capital that's going to be required in order to fuel the energy transition in this country, and this
Mm.
country um, is in competition with many
Yeah.
other countries for that
Yeah.
capital. It's not all going to come from inside the UK, and
Mm.
so we have discussions with very large multinational investors
Mm.
who really want to invest in the energy transition, and a lot of the time it's not necessarily about do they want to invest in a solar park or a wind farm or a battery storage project or a
Yeah.
hydroelectric power plant. It's actually about, well, okay, um, why should I invest in the UK? Why
Yeah.
should I not invest in Germany or the
Yeah.
US? Or it's those sorts of considerations
Mm.
that people have where they have a choice. Um,
Absolutely so. Yeah.
yeah, and I think the last probably weakness, it really goes to my point about the planning and the grid, which is an ability to deliver on the policy
Mm.
targets,
Mm.
and
Mm.
to create a supportive environment
Mm.
that allows the private sector to get on with its job of delivering what the government wants it to.
Yeah.
And again, I feel that might be changing a little bit.
Yeah. So, in a sense, I was going to ask you whether the government should assume more risk, thereby making it easier, perhaps, given all the risks you described earlier, for investors to invest in UK renewable energy projects. But to an extent, it can't take away those two fundamental risks. Obviously, they're policy areas. One is a policy area on planning, but it's also partly cultural. And the other one is physically, how do you get those connections to the grid? Is there anything the government can do to alleviate some of the risks that investors face? And do you think that would attract more investors to the UK?
Yeah, well, look, I think in those specific areas, and they're very, very specific if we consider the wider
Mm.
question of infrastructure. But in renewables, these are obviously really important topics, particularly
Yeah.
about getting to net zero. I think they are doing something. There have been various different initiatives. The creation of Great British Energy,
Yeah.
bringing in the National Wealth Fund, and the sort of folding in of UKIB into that.
Mm.
Both entities which we're engaging with, and are really open and receptive. I think on the grid side, the recent reform to the grid, looking at uh, the kind of use it or lose it concept of these kind of
Yeah,
so-called zombie grid connections out
yeah,
there that people might be able to remove from the queue
mm,
and move, projects that are proceedable further
mm,
up the queue and get them built and get them producing energy. So I think there are lots of good things that are happening.
yeah,
I think if you think about the broader context of just outside of those two particular issues, about the
mm,
balance of risk and reward and what could the government do. Um, Look, I think the answer to that is quite fluid. I really think there are areas of the energy transition that are less proven. Perhaps with the technology that's less
yeah,
proven at commercial scale, so wave technology, for example, um, or with risks that are uncertain
mm,
and therefore difficult for financial investors to take. And I think there is a role there for government in trying to bring technologies into commercial scale, where once they're
yeah,
proven and once they're operating, that
yeah,
then the private sector can do its job,
yeah,
or covering some of these risks until there is sufficient experience and time that has
mm,
elapsed
mm,
so that people better understand those risks and can better quantify them. So I think there's
yeah,
definitely a role there. Um,
yeah,
but then there could also be just some very practical ones. Take Great British Energy, for example. If they, for example, invested in development projects
mm,
and made it clear to local planning authorities that they would automatically appeal any decisions that weren't made in contravention of that were made in contravention
yeah,
of
yeah,
national policy guidelines, perhaps.
yeah,
But so it doesn't necessarily have to involve pounds and pence. I think it can just be a standing
mm,
behind policy kind of four square, which might
yeah,
might
yeah,
encourage some behavioural change.
yeah.
Um, yeah,
Yeah, that would certainly send a signal, wouldn't it? And perhaps
exactly.
there'd be less time wasting in terms of getting these projects approved. Finally, and a very sort of broad question: do you think there's currently a sense of renewed optimism about investing in the UK under the current administration, and perhaps following the budget yesterday?
Yeah, look, I do think there is a sense of optimism. As I mentioned before, I think the tone is very different from with the change of government.
Yeah.
I think there is clarity. I think there is now consistency. I think there are concrete steps being taken to address the issues. I
Mm,
think time will tell how effective those steps are, and
yeah.
but I think the creation of those two entities I talked about, Great British Energy, the National Wealth Fund,
Mm,
I think they're really great initiatives. I think if they are managed well, I think they can make a real difference. I
mm,
think the kind of difficult part of it starts now, right? Which these are great initiatives.
yeah.
It's about what is made of them
Yeah. Yeah.
that is now the real challenge, and will be the acid test of whether we will make it or even close to achieving those
Yeah.
2030 targets.
Well, we'll look forward to seeing how that plays out. Now, for our viewers, if you'd like to hear more from Tom and from our other speakers on related issues, please do come along to the UK Sustainable Infrastructure Summit on the 12th of November in London. Further information at our website www.cityandfinancial.com. Just remains for you to say thank you so much, Tom, for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you on the 12th.
Yeah, thanks ever so much. Really great to have joined you, and I'm really looking forward to it.